There is a moment in every confrontation where one man runs out of silence. That man has already told you everything you need to defeat him, not because he raised his voice or lost his composure in any obvious way, but because he spoke when he did not need to, because the silence became unbearable to him before it became unbearable to you. And in that gap, that thin, almost invisible interval between when the silence could have held and when it broke, the entire outcome was decided. This is not a theory. It is something practitioners of combat understood in Japan before the word psychology had been invented. The samurai schools of the Edo period did not teach silence as a social virtue. They taught it as a form of warfare. The man who could hold stillness longer than his opponent had, in the most practical sense, already won. And the practice they developed to train this capacity had a name that most people, even those who study this tradition, have never encountered in its original context. Before the sword, there was the breath. In the old dojo traditions, there was a ritual performed before every training session, before every formal match, and before every real engagement of consequence. The students would kneel in saiza, the formal seated position, close their eyes, and enter a period of structured silence that could last anywhere from 2 minutes to 20. This was not prayer. It was not rest. It was a precise interior practice called mokuso, and its purpose was singular: to empty the practitioner of everything accumulated since the last time they had been still. Mokuso translates, roughly, as silent thought, though the translation is misleading, in the way that all translations of Japanese practice words are misleading. It was not silent thought in the sense of quiet contemplation. It was the deliberate cessation of the kind of thinking that clutters, the replaying of the morning's argument, the anxiety about the match's outcome, the rehearsal of what you would say and how you would appear. All of that had to be cleared before training could begin, because a mind carrying yesterday's residue would react to today's challenge from the wrong place. It would react from memory rather than from presence. And memory, in a duel, will get you killed. There was a particular teacher in the Ito-ryu school during the late Edo period, referred to only as the Old Man of Edo, never by his given name, who was said to require his students to sit in mokuso until they could hear the silence, rather than merely experience it. This distinction sounds obscure until you have sat in genuine stillness long enough to understand what it means. There is a difference between the absence of noise and the active quality of silence. The first is circumstantial. The second is something the practitioner generates from the inside. The Old Man of Edo taught that a student who could not generate that inner silence at will had no business learning how to use a sword. The man who could not wait. There is a man, call him that, simply a man, who built his life around the quality of his arguments. He was sharp in the way that certain people are sharp, quick to read a room, quick to find the weak seam in a position, quick to press when he sensed retreat. He was the kind of person others described as formidable after meetings, though they often felt, walking away, that something had been taken from them, that they could not account for. He had won a great many arguments in his life. He had also, without quite understanding why, lost a great many of the things arguments are supposed to secure. His work required him to negotiate, not in a formal sense, not across polished tables in rooms with glass walls, but in the continuous low-level negotiation of organizational life. Who gets resources? Who gets credit? Who gets heard when decisions are made? He was skilled at this, but there was a particular kind of opponent he could not solve. The person who said very little. The person who listened to his full position, considered it without expression, and then offered not a counter-argument, but a pause. These encounters unnerved him in a way he could feel physically, a tightening across the chest, a quickening in the hands, an almost overwhelming urge to fill the silence, with more words, better words, a reframing or a concession, or anything that would make the silence end. He always gave in to this urge. He never understood what it cost him. He knew, in the abstract, that he talked too much in these moments. He had been told as much by people he trusted. But knowing it, and feeling the silence close around you, like water rising in a sealed room, are two entirely different experiences. The silence of a skilled opponent is not neutral. It is active. It asks you questions you have not prepared to answer. It suggests, without stating, that what you have just said was insufficient. It creates a pressure that most people, nearly all people raised in the modern West, where silence in conversation is coded as failure or hostility, cannot sustain without breaking. What silence is made of. The samurai understanding of silence was not passive. This is the central thing that Western readings of Japanese philosophy most consistently miss. When Zen teachers spoke of emptiness, and when the sword schools translated that emptiness into combat practice, they were not describing the absence of something. They were describing the presence of something so complete that nothing external could disturb it. Mokuso was the training ground for this state, but the state itself had a different name in the warrior tradition. It was called Mushin, no mind, and it was considered the apex of what a practitioner could achieve. Mushin was not blankness. A practitioner in Mushin was extraordinarily alert, extraordinarily present. What had been eliminated was not awareness, but the noise that filters awareness, the preference for certain outcomes, the fear of specific failures, the ego's constant editorial on what was happening, and what it meant. Strip those away, and what remains is pure reception. The practitioner in Mushin sees everything in the room, without fixating on any part of it. He hears everything, without interpreting it through the lens of what he wants to hear. He is, in the most functional sense, completely available to what is actually happening, rather than to his version of it. The connection between mokuso and mushin was not incidental. Mokuso was the daily practice that gradually wore away, the accumulated sediment of preference, fear, and narrative that builds up in any person living an active life in the world. A single session might not produce mushin, but years of daily mokuso, years of returning, every morning and every evening, to the discipline of sitting with silence, until the silence generated itself from within, produced, in the most serious practitioners, something that looked from the outside like uncanny calm. It was not calm. It was clarity. The difference between a man who is suppressing his anxiety and a man who has genuinely arrived at stillness is something any trained observer can read in approximately 4 seconds. The man who cannot wait, the one who breaks every silence before it has finished speaking, is not weak. He is simply untrained in the specific and learnable discipline of interior quiet. It was not spiritual practice in the sense of aspiring toward some transcendent state. It was functional training for a functional problem. How do you remain still when every biological and social instinct you have is screaming at you to move, to speak, to close the gap? You train. The same way you train any other capacity. That does not come naturally. You sit with the discomfort until the discomfort loses its authority over you. The silence was never about you. Here is the turn that changes everything that came before it. The samurai did not practice mokuso in order to become harder to read. That was a consequence, not the purpose. They did not practice it to gain an advantage in negotiation, or to project an intimidating stillness, or to win any particular encounter. These outcomes followed from the practice, but a man who practiced mokuso in order to achieve them would find the practice hollow, and the outcomes elusive. The real purpose of mokuso, the purpose the old teachers spent years trying to transmit to students who kept missing it, was not competitive at all. It was this: to make a man genuinely indifferent to the outcome of the encounter he was about to enter. Not indifferent in the sense of not caring. Indifferent in the precise Japanese sense of non-attachment. The understanding, arrived at through sustained practice, rather than intellectual conclusion, that the outcome of any given confrontation is not the thing that defines you. What defines you is what you bring into the room before a single word has been spoken. A man who enters a confrontation needing a particular outcome will be readable by anyone paying attention. The need will be there, in the quality of his attention, in the pace of his speech, in what he cannot resist saying. A man who enters without need, who has genuinely settled the question of loss before the encounter began, is entering from an entirely different position. Not stronger, exactly. Emptier. And emptiness, in the tradition that produced mokuso, was always the stronger position. The man who could not wait did not understand this for most of his professional life. He understood silence as a tactic, a thing his opponents deployed against him, a thing he theoretically could deploy against others. This framing kept him inside the competitive logic of the encounter, which is exactly where the silence was defeating him. He was treating silence as a weapon in a game he was already losing. What the samurai teachers understood, and what took him decades to arrive at, is that silence is not a weapon at all. It is the natural condition of a man who has nothing to defend. And a man with nothing to defend cannot be threatened. Not because he is invulnerable, because there is no target. What the last speaker carries home. There came a point in the man's career, he was in his late 40s, the kind of age where certain recognitions arrive, with the weight of time behind them, when he stopped preparing what he would say before difficult conversations, not because he had become careless, but because he had gradually discovered, through a series of encounters he could not explain, by his old framework, that the preparation was the problem. Every word he rehearsed was a word freighted with need. Every argument he refined in advance was an argument he was already attached to. He was walking into rooms carrying the full weight of what he wanted. And his opponents, the skilled ones, the ones who had somehow always bested him, were walking in carrying almost nothing. He began to sit in silence before meetings, not in any formal practice, not with any awareness of mokuso or its history. He sat in his car in parking structures and did nothing for 5 minutes. He arrived early to rooms and refused to fill the time with his phone. He began to notice what happened in his body when he let silence exist without filling it. The initial discomfort, the old pull toward speech, and then, if he held past that edge, something else. A settling, a reduction of something that had always been there, running underneath everything, that he now recognized as the constant low hum of wanting the situation to go a particular way. When that hum quieted, even partially, he found that he could hear the room with a precision that had not been available to him before. He did not become a different man. He still had positions, still cared about outcomes, still felt the old pressure rise in his chest when negotiations turned. But something in his relationship to that pressure had shifted. He was no longer at its mercy. He could feel it without obeying it. And because he was no longer obeying it, he stopped speaking before he meant to. He stopped offering concessions to a silence that had asked him for nothing. He stopped explaining himself to opponents who had not yet questioned him. In rooms where he had always given too much away too early, he began to notice the moment when the other side, the one with the inscrutable expression and the long pauses, began, almost imperceptibly, to fill the silence themselves. The old man of Edo, whoever he was, had understood this. Mokuso was not preparation for combat, in the way that a soldier loads a weapon before battle. It was preparation for presence, for arriving in the encounter as a man who had already been where the confrontation was trying to send him and had come back undiminished. The samurai who practiced it did not necessarily say less in absolute terms. They said less at the wrong moment. That is a distinction that takes most people a lifetime to learn, if they learn it at all. The words you do not say before you have thought them. The ground you do not give before it has been asked for. The silence you hold one breath past the point, where every instinct in your body is begging you to fill it. The man retired early, by the standards of his industry. His colleagues assumed this was a form of withdrawal, that he had tired of the game, or lost his appetite for it. Some said he had gone soft. He did not correct them. On the last day, he cleared his office. His assistant asked if he had any advice for her before he left. He sat with the question for a long moment, longer than was comfortable, long enough that she began to formulate something, to fill the pause. And then he said, "The next time someone makes you an offer, and then goes quiet, do not speak first. Just wait." She nodded, uncertain. He picked up the last box and walked out. He drove home in silence with the radio off. His wife was in the garden when he arrived. She looked up, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a while. The afternoon held them both, without requiring anything. He had finally become someone the silence did not need to defeat. The men who found this useful were not looking for motivation. They were looking for something older than that. If that is what brought you here, subscribe. There is more.